Okay. Well, let me welcome you to the, it's actually second public workshop of on the assessment of zero-emission vehicle requirements for light and heavy-duty vehicle fleets. This is a joint workshop between the Mobile Source Control Division and ECARS, which stands for Emissions Compliance, Automotive Regulations and Science Division. So with that said, my name is Craig During. I'm with MSCD, Mobile Source Control Division. I'm currently managing the efforts for advanced clean trucks, and I think we'll just do introductions at the table here. Who wants to go next?
So I'll go. So Tony Brazil, Branch Chief of Transportation and Clean Technology Branch in MSCD.
And Gerhard Achterlijk with the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure section in Emission Compliance, Automotive Regulation Science, or ECARS.
Joshua Cunningham, Chief of the Advanced Clean Cars Branch within ECARS.
All right, good. So this workshop is scheduled for 1 hour, and we may or may not take up that whole hour. And following this workshop, we do have a work group meeting that's going to start at 12:30. That really is a continuation of the fleet and manufacturer meeting that we started on the heavy duty side. So we thought we'd do a workshop to, again, give you some updates on where we're at from fleet's perspective on both light and heavy duty side, and then continue our discussions really focusing on the heavy duty side later on today. What's that? Oh yeah, I'll get to that. So the materials, we do not have copies of the materials, but they are available on our website. Just go to our homepage and search Advanced Clean Trucks meetings and events. You'll see copies of the presentation and any other materials that we have. And then sign in, want to make sure everybody was able to sign in downstairs. If we missed you, we should have a sign-in sheet available in the back table at the end of this meeting. So the way this is going to work, we're going to do the presentation first. I've got a presentation that'll last maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. And as Tony just reminded me, we need to make an announcement in the event there is an alarm. We do have some evacuation procedures. First of all, we ask you to listen for instructions. Typically after the alarm, they give us some instructions on what to do. And if it does require us to vacate the building, there is a relocation place that's across the street from us at Cesar Chavez Park. And finally, just a last bit of information. This meeting will be webcast, or is webcast. And it also is being recorded. So we'll make that recording available for those who missed the meeting for some reason. That'll be available on our website. And after our presentation, we will open it up for questions, both from you'll be able to email us questions and comments, and the email address should be scrolling at the bottom of the webcast, as well as in the room here. We're welcome to questions and comments. But please, before you state your question or comment, identify your name and your affiliation before you talk. And because it is webcast, we ask that you speak into the microphone so people on the webcast can hear you. Oh, and I guess one last thing. There are some restrooms located on this floor, actually. If you exit the room and turn left, there are restrooms located there. So the agenda for today's meeting, hang on a minute. So the agenda is pretty much set up like this. First, we're going to remind you of the governor's directive to accelerate the use of zero-emission vehicles in both light and heavy-duty fleets. We're then going to introduce a new website and email bulletin to provide information focused specifically on zero-emission fleets and the fleet rules. We're also going to provide an overview or remind everyone of our electric vehicle electrification goals and our efforts to align zero-emission vehicle rollout, our rollout strategy with markets that have the best potential for success. We're then going to discuss our ideas on collecting vehicle information, vehicle-specific information, to help us, the California Air Resources Board, understand existing operational duty cycles, and access vehicle characteristics that would be best suited for electrification. And then finally, we're going to have a we'll have an individual discussion on the next steps from both the light duty and heavy duty side. So in case you're not aware, on August 1st, the governor did sign a directive to the California Air Resources Board to explore new regulatory actions to accelerate zero-emission vehicles in both the light and heavy-duty fleets. The directive requires us to consider opportunities in a broad range of company-owned fleets, including fleets owned and operated by public and private sectors, new mobility fleets, large employer fleets, rental fleets, delivery fleets, and of course, transportation network companies, which include companies like Uber and Lyft. So, we do have a new website, and this is kind of a snapshot of what the website looks like. This website was created to provide updated information on all of our zero-emission fleets. This includes both light duty and heavy duty fleets. We've also started a new email bulletin list to disseminate updated information, news, and events related to any of our zero-emission fleet activities. We ask that you sign up for our email bulletin to receive future announcements from us specifically related to zero-emission fleet requirements. And I'm going to, real quick, just show you what this website looks like, if I can find it. So here's a new website. It's not showing? Uh-oh. Yeah, it's still dark. Paul, what do I do? All right.
Just go back to the slide.
Yeah. Is that coming back now?
It's not coming back. Just go back to the.
That's what I am. Hang on, we're having technical difficulties here.
So we did mention the meeting wouldn't take the whole hour, so maybe we're done. We're just trying to get the presentation back on at this point. Well, can you hit the F4 button or anything like that?
Okay, we're back. Anyway, this is a new website created specifically for fleets with zero-emission vehicles. Let's just move on. So as part of our vehicle electrification goals, we believe it's important to align our electrification efforts with the markets best suited for its use. By aligning these efforts, we can help ensure success of our fleet rule development and to accelerate market penetration. This requires a better understanding of various vehicle configurations, the duty cycles in which they operate, the fueling infrastructure that supports their operation, and the costs associated with operating both conventional and zero-emission technologies. We believe that capturing this information will aid in identifying vehicles with the greatest potential for electrification and developing a strategy for early market penetration. So to, again, further elaborate, to restate, we do believe that collecting certain fleet information will help us develop our policies and regulatory efforts for initial market penetration of electric vehicles. Therefore, we're proposing to collect, so one of the things we want to do is start collecting fleet information on vehicle characteristics such as vehicle type, configuration, usage, mileage, and information on access to fueling infrastructure. We will be working with our stakeholders to identify the appropriate information we should be collecting to achieve our goals, and that's part of what we're going to be doing at the next meeting this afternoon. Initially, we feel that there are vehicle operating characteristics that are best suited for electrification. These would include fleet vehicles that operate in urban city environments with low average speed of operation, fleet vehicles that are centrally fueled, and fleet vehicles that typically make multiple stops during the day and may experience long idle times. However, we also believe there are other applications where electric vehicles can be used while still meeting operational needs. We look forward to working with the fleet owners and our stakeholders to identify all applications where electric vehicles can be used in service. With that said, we've identified an initial set of affected stakeholders as those companies with the following characteristics. Typically larger companies, public fleets and utilities, last mile delivery companies, and rental fleets and taxi fleets. This is simply an initial list, and a more detailed list of stakeholders will be discussed at future work group meetings. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gerhard, talk a little bit about next steps from the light duty side.
So now we'll shift to on the light duty side, and this is a team effort at ARB. A lot of times, sometimes regulations are within a single group. This time we're spanning multiple divisions. And so we're looking, the light duty side also has a unique application because we both have the governor's executive order and the Senate Bill 1014. I always throw in a few extra numbers, but just 1014, which is the Clean Miles Standard. And we'll be looking to hold a meeting early next year to start the discussion on the Clean Miles Standard. And the focus of that effort is on app-based ride-hailing services. But along with that, that bill actually requires a regulation in terms of grams of CO2 per passenger mile. And along with that, we will also be conducting an inventory assessment of fleets beyond the ride-hailing services, as Greg had mentioned. So we will looking to evaluate how the light-duty fleet, if it needs additional regulations beyond what is required through 1014, and which is focused on ride-hailing service. And we have an email notification topic that is specific to the it's titled, the name of the topic is Clean Miles Standard, and the link in the presentation, Clean Miles Standard. And on either one of those, if you can't remember, if the link doesn't work, if you go to ARB's home page and you look at the upper left corner on ARB's home page, there's a little envelope along with your the Facebook and Twitter symbols. But that envelope symbol actually takes you to GovOps, which is the new name for ARB's email distribution list. And you can sign up there, and depending on how you select it, you could actually have the option for email or text notifications. But that'll take you to a list of ARB's distribution notices, and you'll see the Clean Miles Standard and this fleet standard at that point. And then, yeah, that was actually, so that covers the main thing. And our lead staff person is, at this point, is Banpreet, who's also in the room here, and then the manager leading the regulatory side of the Clean Miles Standard effort is Shobna Asani, but she's based in El Monte, and she actually has a workshop, participating in a workshop on ZEV incentives, so we're double booked today. But you'll get more notifications if you sign up on the Clean Miles Standard notice.
Yeah, and then I just want to follow up, talk a little bit about the next steps from the heavy duty side. Good, we're still live. I just want to remind everybody that we are still moving forward with a manufacturer regulation. We've had several workshops on that effort so far. That's not going away. We fully intend to move forward with a manufacturer requirement to start producing zero emission trucks typically from anywhere from Class 2B and above. That recommendation is scheduled to go to the board mid of next year, 2019. And we believe that part of that, presentation to the board would also include some type of a reporting requirement for fleets. But that's what that's what we intend to do at our next workshop is continue our discussions with the fleet and the manufacturers on a regulatory concept for zero emission trucks being manufactured, as well as what a reporting requirement might look like. So really, that's to sum it up in a nutshell. And for those of you who are going to stick around for the next work group meeting, we're going to go into a lot more detail, looking at the different categories of trucks that are best suited for electrification, as well as a discussion on cost and truck specs and other things like that. So, and the lead staff for this effort is Paul. And if you don't know Paul, are you here? Go ahead and stand up. So Paul is our lead staff on this effort, and if you have any questions or would like to meet with us, please send him an email. He can certainly set up that meeting. Is there anything else, Tony? Or? Okay. Well, go ahead.
So knowing that Craig's later event here is going to be focused on heavy-duty applications as we go into the public comments and feedback. The light-duty team will not be in that later event later today, so if you have specific ideas on light-duty fleets, particularly as it relates to the reporting requirements that Craig mentioned, the duty cycles, the fleet types that we should be starting to investigate, we'd love to hear that now because we won't be in that later session today. So we are looking for feedback, as Craig noted in his slide, on the types of non-ride-hailing fleets that we should be investigating, which types of organizations we should be gaining a better understanding on, and particularly looking for ones that are higher mileage and larger fleet sizes. And just to, again, iterate what Gerhard said, early next year, we will have a dedicated workshop on the Clean Mile Standard. So that's where you'll get all the detail for that new program specifically.
And I'll just add to that a little bit. So as you see here, we're discussing a fleet reporting requirement. In part, it's because we've been working with manufacturers and fleets on what a manufacturer requirement needs to look like, and ultimately understanding vehicle composition, who has them, and how they're operated is a key part of that. So right now, we believe that having some of that discussion with the manufacturer and fleet meetings is a way to handle that. And we're proposing that reporting requirements be discussed as a concept here. We'll also discuss it there. And then beyond that is there's still some things up in the air as to how we should handle it best and how we should organize or conduct meetings. At this point, in terms of looking at heavy-duty fleets, we don't know that it's better to have a separate meeting on just fleet reporting requirements, completely separate from the manufacturer requirements, because they are so interrelated. And then one of the topics that we'd like to get the feedback, I think, as Joshua touched on, is to the extent we do have fleets reporting, for us, it makes sense to have a reporting requirement and a manufacturer requirement go to the board as a single effort. We could do it separately. And then the question is, we already know that we need more details from fleets we think, to come up with a fleet-specific kind of regulation. For light duty, we believe having better information is going to be a part of ultimately designing something further that goes there. And it's possible, or quite conceivable, that some fleets will have both light-duty cars and trucks and be affected by our efforts. And so to the extent that we consider those factors and potentially even reporting requirements, depending on how the assessment of other data comes out, we are interested in getting feedback on how we should try to approach that topic. Should it be part of another effort? Should it be an independent effort, and things like that? So if you do have some comments on that, let us know. And again, this can evolve over time, and that is the reason we're trying to put this website together. So it's like, hey, if you know you might be affected or you want to keep tabs, we will always use this particular list as a notification to any individualized or separate rulemaking effort, so that you can always be up to date. So with that, we'll leave it open to comments. Could somebody have microphones around? And remember to identify your name and affiliation. when you do speak for the people on the webcast.
Thank you, and good morning. My name is Matt Rapp with Velocity Vehicle Group. Appreciate the opportunity to make a comment here. Just a quick question, Tony, and clarification, if you don't mind. When we talk about this question of should we parse out fleets and manufacturers for reporting, I guess the first question is we don't necessarily have a construct for what you're envisioning private fleets at a minimum to report. Is that correct? And kind of as a follow-up to that, is it couched in the idea that it would be combined with the truckers reporting system and it would be all-encompassing insofar as on-road standards and then whatever this next regulation we're doing here is? And if that's the case, then it would seem that probably the most effective way to get to fleet needs versus manufacturer needs would be to have two separate workshops. That would be, I think personally, because manufacturers are going to give one perspective of how they're able to create these vehicles and timelines, commercial availability, warranties and whatnot. Whereas the end users are like, what do you mean? I have to go buy new trucks again now? I thought we just went through this. So I think parsing the two out will help be more effective from that perspective. So if you can just follow up on what you're envisioning for this reporting mechanism. Is it truckers or is it another acronym?
Well, in terms of the reporting system, to an extent, we're not at a point to say that truckers would be the best way to do it. Although, and so those of you who aren't familiar, truckers is the truck regulations upload compliance and reporting system that we use for truck and bus compliance. And that's where fleets are reporting either that they have the filters or the newer trucks in their fleet to meet the compliance requirements. So we already do receive from a number of fleets information on those who are using the flexibility options in the rule. And in some cases that includes mileage, but only for low use vehicles. There is a lot of other information that we think we need to have to better understand where the best opportunities are for electrification, especially in the early years, because again, our time frame on the manufacturer requirement is through the 2030 time frame, but not beyond that, because we envision coming back at a future date to determine what should happen beyond 2030. And so as a concept of a fleet rule, we would be looking at what would be appropriate requirements for fleets. And the challenge there is that as kind of Craig touched on, we want to find where the market is most likely to head, where the opportunities are going to be. And so to an extent that we have a very high mileage, long distance fleet, electrification might not be the best strategy for them. And another company with the exact same vehicles might do a lot of stop and go urban kind of driving where it might be ideal for them or even potentially ultimately save money. And so being able to understand those details at the fleet level is critical because a law of averages doesn't really work when you're talking about individual fleet rules. I think to touch on the other point that you kind of touched on, the truck and bus regulation did require and does require accelerated replacements. As far as looking at electrification strategies and fleet requirements, we are starting with the approach of looking at new vehicle purchases because they aren't available used, but to try to make sure that fleet requirements would be consistent with what fleet's normal purchasing patterns are to a degree. We expect there will probably be some variation, but we're not looking generally at strategies for accelerated replacements. The time horizons, again, we're shooting in the 2024, 2025 timeframe to kind of a starting point through 2030 or beyond, depending on how things play out. So there's a lot of things to be discussed. And then to touch on our vision of how we would coordinate the meetings. On heavy-duty side, we've already looked into a lot of vehicle-specific characteristics that we need, and truck configuration is pretty important. On the car side, it's a little more straightforward because there's many variables. We tried to do a survey. We got some information on that. But at the end of the day, we determined we need a lot more information from fleets. To be able to do that, one of our basic goals is to match what the fleet's either existing vehicles already do and how they're configured on the heavy-duty side, and how that relates to the chassis or the truck configurations that either are available now or are coming in the next several years. As a starting point, there's more beyond that, as we touched on, like for cost and how they're used. So as part of the one bullet here on the slide is, we think having some of that discussion with the manufacturers and fleets together does make sense as a starting point. And then depending on how, I guess, elaborate or detailed the discussion needs to be, that we could have separate meetings to do that at different times and still do it in a coordinated fashion, or possibly split out to do separate meetings. But because there's so much overlap on what's available, what's built, and how they're configured on the truck side, we see that there's going to be a need to have shared meetings at minimum.
Great, thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer, Tony. I won't hog the microphone here for everyone else's purposes, but it'll be interesting to see how everything jives with the useful life provision under SB1. And then kind of, it sounds like this type of motivation is maybe a la the ISR rule to start encouraging people to go above and beyond CARB standards because, again, you have the useful life provision. We're still in the throngs of the on-road rule. So, you know, again, from an effective standpoint, I can tell you that the OEMs are already talking to their major customers who are planning on using ZEV or near zero equipment. I know this for a fact, and I'd welcome any OEM to tell me otherwise. But, you know, word to the wise, if you're telling me that you're going to write a regulation to mirror people's normal buying cycles, and obviously the law of averages don't work. But, you know, I think that the most telling thing probably was the Diesel Technologies Forum study about the adoption of 2010 engine technology in California being at the bottom because everyone was too busy meeting these interim retrofit standards instead of doing their normal turnover. So caution is, you know, when you talk about normal turnover cycles, people might be doing stuff sooner than they would have expected unless from some regulation that perhaps might have arbitrary dates because, as you mentioned, there is no law of averages. So thank you again.
Bud Beebe with the California Hydrogen Business Council. I noticed in your slides there that you identified a couple of things that you thought were particularly important for this first thrust into fleets, and that was long idling times, short haul, and central fueling. And with fuel cell vehicles, of course, some of those things aren't very important just because of the longer range capability and the ability to fuel faster. So I'd caution you to not narrow the list so closely that fuel cell vehicles and their greater capabilities in that way would be shut out from this. Secondly, you know, some vehicles that really are a part of a fleet spend their night times at home with craftsmen and other people who might be hauling pipe and all kinds of really sort of like, I think probably class 3. I'm not real good on 3s and 4s and some of that, you know, a lot of overlap. But some of those vehicles may well not spend the night in a yard. And so in your information gathering, you might want to think about how you can capture that. And then just a curious question about autonomous vehicles. Is there some sort of blanket statement that the state is making about autonomous vehicles and whether they ought to be zero emission vehicles or not? So those are the things.
Well, I can take that last piece first. From a light duty standpoint, with a little bit of connection to heavier applications, yes, the governor's office in partnership with the state agencies a couple of weeks ago released our set of principles, guiding principles for policy development on automated vehicles. So if you go to the Office of Policy Research, OPR, we have a 2-page description that lays out our priorities as we start to develop policies on automated vehicles that is geared towards ensuring we move towards sustainable business models, sustainable applications of them. And clean vehicles electrification is a priority. So that's a direction from the governor's office is where we can in policy for automated vehicles move towards that, but also pooling and shared use applications.
And so those answers are within sort of that whole policy column, if you will, and what you'll be doing here won't specifically address that. You'll just be doing fleet stuff, and however the fleet people meet those things, whether with auto or not. Or
yeah, well, the goal of that set of principles was to lay out a set of guiding principles for any kind of policy that is picked up by the state. So it was the first major effort by the governor's office along with the state agencies to ensure that we have some common agreement on where we want to go with and how we want to encourage the automated vehicle market and rollout. How that is implemented, it will vary by policy. So those are principles. And then for the example with the Clean Miles Standard, which is an effort that Gerhard noted we'll have a separate workshop on, that is a requirement on ride-hailing fleets, and I do anticipate that that's an example of a policy that will have automated vehicles as a compliance mechanism or possibly even a regulated party. So how that is implemented will vary by rule and program, and so I would encourage you to follow that particular process. But those guiding principles were meant to be a higher level set of directions for as we think of policies to consider these areas.
And so the question about is your information culling effort going to be narrowly aimed at long idle, short haul, central fuel people?
So
I think I got those right. I don't know.
no, you've got the list right. So I was kind of looking at the detail on the slide there, but we didn't put an and or an or there. So it could be any of those. I don't think it has to be all of them at the same time. And when we talk about electric vehicles, as far as I'm concerned, we're always talking about fuel cell or battery electric. Yeah. In both cases, there's a longer term perspective as to what the market may look like and what the fueling network could look like. And so we are tending to focus on centrally fueled fleets, in part because we expect that in many cases we're going to be talking about infrastructure potentially installed at the depot or the yard property. Of course, to the extent that there are opportunities or there are publicly available stations in the next 5 to 10 years that we can expect to see, let's just use an example, as a port application is something that is on the list for ARB to do. It'll be a slightly different group than ours. We will have information linking to that on this website. But in an application like that, there could be 1 or 2 fueling stations that's available to the port truck drivers. And to the extent that we see that there's opportunities to do that, and we specifically are looking at a regulatory strategy in that application, it wouldn't necessarily be expected to be at an individual's yard or home in that application. So I think we'll obviously be, or not obviously, our basic plan will be to gather more information and then adjust the strategy accordingly. So to the extent that there are opportunities beyond centrally fueled fleets, that we would look at that and look at that as part of the overall proposal.
Thank you.
Morning, everyone. This is David Rentschler, City of Fairfield.
I think we had a question up here first. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. So for the public side we had the private side. From the public side, 2 questions. One, I heard that there's going to be something changing from the public fleet rule to have public fleets follow the truck and bus regulation. Is that correct? And if so, what's the start date on that?
I guess the best way to answer it is no, I don't think that's correct. What's happening is starting in 2020, trucks that aren't compliant with the truck and bus regulation will not be able to be registered in the state at the DMV. Public fleets, in terms of our rules, effectively fully implemented several years ago. Public fleets are not part of the truck and bus rule, and so won't be directly affected by that. What I think the issue that you're potentially raising is that there are some vehicles that, like, I'll just use the example, solid waste collection vehicles, there wasn't a reporting requirement. That Rule 2 was fully implemented in the 2010 timeframe. But those are a lot of private companies. Because they don't have to report, we can't readily identify them. When they go to the DMV, they won't be able to register if they're not identified as complying with the truck and bus rule, because the DMV won't know if they're subject to the truck and bus rule or not. And so we need to iron that out. There are some quasi-public fleets, private fleets that we might have some issues with there, and so we just need to identify them.
So it just means that we'll have to sell some of our stuff out of state instead of to private? So
For
like if I have a
public fleets that aren't
2007
federal, they won't be affected by that, or the intent of that bill is to not affect that. In terms of electrification, of course, we are looking at public fleets and what the future should hold.
So second question was, someone had mentioned about reporting, and I'm wondering, do you see this reporting as similar to the doors reporting that we're doing now for public fleets, off-road equipment? Or is it something different from a public fleet side? Somebody mentioned the truckers reporting that you do now for private. We don't do that in public, but we do doors reporting, so.
So I could say in terms of the truckers reporting system, we do receive information about diesel trucks and fleets that comply with that rule. If we decided that that was a good vehicle or a system to use for purposes of collecting characteristics from fleets, including public fleets, we could potentially use that. It is similar to the off-road door system in principle. You're reporting VIN and engine information in that case that's for on-road vehicles. You actually raised that interesting point because ARB2 is looking at strategies to electrify off-road equipment. TRUs, potentially tractors and other types of equipment. I guess we should think about if we're going to get information from a fleet for ultimately crafting rules in that vein, that we might think about whether we should be collecting some information about off-road equipment for future planning.
I wasn't trying to open a new can of worms, Tony.
But it's kind of a good point because, I mean, to the extent that we're going to do something soon, because we are in some categories, it might be prudent to have fleet report information one time rather than having separate types of requirements that on different kinds of equipment. There's pros and cons to either approach, but I guess we'll just think about it internally a little bit. How do we, because again, our goal is to get the best information to have the best policy and to do it in the least disruptive way we can. And so we're going to find the right balance.
Thank you.
Tim Blubaugh with the Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association. And Tony, I wanted to address your question about the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, the manufacturer requirement, the fleet reporting requirement. We have, I think, long and consistently advocated very strongly that to successfully deploy zero-emission commercial vehicles, to successfully deploy them in any market would require vehicles that can get the job done, fleets that can utilize those vehicles, and some infrastructure to either recharge or refuel those vehicles. So we believe all three of those aspects are necessary for any successful deployment. So when we look at your question about whether the fleet reporting requirement, and we're not quite sure what that is, and it sounds a bit out of balance with a vehicle manufacturer's sales requirement, but since we don't understand it, we'll keep an open mind. But nonetheless, we feel very strongly that they should be addressed together, simultaneously, and quite frankly, include the infrastructure question as well. But to directly answer your question, we strongly believe that the fleet manufacturer requirement, the manufacturer sales requirement, and the fleet reporting requirement should be addressed simultaneously, not separately.
So at this point, I mean, we're not going to make any specific judgment as to how to proceed, because we do need to have some discussions. But our initial plan is obviously, because we have fleets and manufacturers in a room, that this is going to overlap with what those reporting requirements might look like. And then based on that, I think over some time figure out, do we just need a separate track to have completely independent meetings that parties would be invited to, or do we simply have a couple of meetings that are focused on that as a topic, whereas other work group meetings could focus on details that not everybody necessarily needs to be involved in or is interested in until we kind of flesh out better information.
Understood. And I know it's just an initial question, but our initial reaction is they should be done together. We think there's a tremendous amount of overlap and synergy.
Good morning. My name is Ian McMillan. I'm a planning and rules manager at the South Coast Air Quality Management District. I'm working on our indirect source rules. We are in fact looking at accelerating beyond the truck and bus rule. I know not a very popular thing in some quarters, but we do have some air quality problems down there. I think, in a lot of we've had a number of working groups down, over the last couple of years down there. We're, advancing some regulatory concepts. Right now, we are tentatively planning to bring a warehouse indirect source rule to our board in about a year. That's a very tentative date right now. A lot of public process along the way. One of the things we have been talking about is maybe a fleet certification program that would be tied to our indirect source rule. A lot of details to be worked out. We've talked about some of it publicly, a lot of it, with stakeholders as well. I think there's probably some potential overlap with some reporting that you're talking about. I think we should we'll continue to participate in your meetings, and I think a lot of synergies are going to be developing here over the next year. So I look forward to working with you guys on that. I do have a question that would be helpful to understand. So in previous presentations, you all have presented sort of summaries of all of the various activities that are happening. I'm thinking more on the heavy duty side and medium duty side than on the light duty side. A lot of activities on the regulatory front, our agency, your agency, the PUC, the CEC, there's a lot of things happening right now. There's a mobile source strategy that the CAR board adopted and took a look at in March earlier this year. We now have the governor's directive. I'm trying to understand what might be different. Are there new specific rulemakings that have been announced by CARB? So it sounds like you're talking about potentially a new one on fleet reporting. It sounds like that will be its own discrete rule potentially. And then has there also been anything announced as far as any potential discrete rule on fleet requirements, or is this still all being kind of formed? And I just want to get it clear in my head, the different kinds of rulemaking that might be different than what's in the mobile source strategy already.
Yeah, and we didn't provide that background in this particular presentation, but as you may be aware, we do have some specific fleet rules that our board is considering or soon will be within a matter of months. We have the innovative clean transit effort that we've been doing. We have an airport shuttle bus effort, and the zero emission powertrain certification to kind of be really the starting point of establishing the certification process for future rules. And then we, not being our particular group, but ARB has presented to the board that we would start working on a drayage truck regulation to electrify the drayage truck fleets. And that would be roughly the 2022 timeframe that the regulation would be presented to the board with a 2026, 2025 beginning implementation date. The ports themselves have identified their own, I'm sure, as you're fully aware of. So right now, in terms of trying to be consistent here with the governor's directive is, and from the discussions we have had with fleets and manufacturers in the manufacturer requirement discussion, we already know that in the heavy duty space, we need more details than is available from any source that we can find to help us better understand how to craft a fleet rule. And as we kind of touched on in our mobile source strategy and other documents, we identified last mile delivery as a category, but that's a pretty broad category, and how you interpret that remains to be seen. So for us, the idea of collecting information from fleets, yet to be identified exactly which ones, would be the starting point of having the details that we need to craft a specific proposal and to identify specific either fleets or categories or vehicle types that we would target. So to me, it's step one in developing a fleet strategy. And then I can say more broadly, we are interested, if possible, to come up with an overall arching rule requirement that could apply to a wide range of fleets, rather than having 10 or 12 different kinds of rules focused on any particular segments. There's challenges with approaching it either way. And so those are the things that would be worked out after having some of those details that we could possibly use it. And on the heavy duty side, as I mentioned, step one is making sure that the electrified configurations that a fleet might need matches with at least the configuration of their trucks. And then there's multiple other steps is, okay, are their usage patterns consistent, or is their ability or access to fueling a barrier or not? And then cost will ultimately be part of the overall decision. All of those, we need better information on each of those to kind of figure out what the best strategy is.
Thanks. That all makes a lot of sense. I think just so I'm clear, with the advanced clean trucks, that's its own regulatory effort. That sounds like right now that is a manufacturing requirement, right? A percent of sales, something like that, right? Are you thinking, just sounding from the timelines or thinking of the timeline that you're talking about, any fleet requirements would be a separate effort potentially from that advanced clean trucks, or has that been decided yet?
I'll say it hasn't been decided, but there is no barrier to saying we're going to take a recommendation to the board that says, here's what the manufacturer requirement looks like starting in the 2025 timeframe, for instance, and here's the reporting requirement for fleets. Board, when you approve the proposal, you're approving both at the same time. Whether it's technically a separate regulation or combined regulation, we can do it at the same time. There's no advantage to separating them from our viewpoint at this point, unless timing-wise, we can't resolve enough issues. And then the other point I guess I want to make is one of the things we're looking to do is to identify who would report, and then we would use that information to craft rules. The people who report aren't necessarily going to be the people who are ultimately regulated, because it really depends on what information we get. So it's, as I mentioned, step one is to get some information on characteristics, but then we can craft a strategy that may be broader or more narrow than the people that we would initially have report. So those aren't 100% in sequence, if you will.
Good morning.
Let me throw one more thing in case it does come up in part of this discussion. So part of it is with a manufacturer requirement, we need a lot longer lead time than we do for fleet rules. So timing-wise, it also works out pretty well if we're shooting for a 2024 or 2025 manufacturer sales requirement, that we could go to the board with a recommendation in 2022 for a fleet requirement that would start in 2024, for instance. But we couldn't go into 2022 and have a manufacturer requirement start in 2024, just because of lead times and things like that.
Good morning. Bill McGavin with the Coalition for Clean Air with just some general comments. First of all, we're very supportive of this effort, and I think that there's a good chance that the governor's letter was prompted by the data showing that emissions from the transportation sector, when it comes to greenhouse gases, that's the only sector where emissions have actually been going up rather than down. And of course, your board as well as CTC are meeting in Los Angeles right now to talk about ways to address that. And I think what we're talking about here is also one of the important ways to address that. And also when we're talking about local air pollution, by far the vast majority of the emissions that are causing our most important pollutants are coming from transportation. When we talk about greenhouse gases, if we include upstream, CARB has said it's about 50%. So, this to us is an important piece of a suite of measures that are underway to address those critical problems. When it comes to light duty, we're definitely looking forward eagerly to the kickoff of the process on the SB 1014 implementation. That was a bill that we supported all the way through the legislature. And so that's a priority for us, is to get that standard set. And then when it comes to heavy duty, it does, to me, really make sense that if you could, you would bring the manufacturer requirement and the fleet requirement to the board at the same time. So we agree with the manufacturers on that, and with your intention. I think for members of the public who are interested in weighing in, it will make a lot more sense to see those paired and give people a better chance to comment on what's going on in the truck sector.
Bill, to make sure I didn't mishear you, you said that you support having a manufacturer requirement and a fleet reporting requirement go to the board at the same time? Or a fleet rule?
Well, yes, I understand that you're saying you would start with the reporting requirement and then use that information. I certainly would not object to your coming forward with a fleet rule, but I understand the way you're staging it.
Yeah, I don't think there's enough time to do that one. Okay, great, thank you.
Paul Court with Earth Justice. Two questions. First, I'd like to hear kind of from the light duty folks whether you're also approaching it from this preference for a single rule that covers multiple fleets, or whether you're thinking about multiple rules, looking at different fleets. And then sort of second, and maybe I should have led with this, I would say our concern is that we need to start rolling these things out sooner rather than later. And so the strategy of waiting to do everything all at once, would be great as long as it's not sort of delaying the process. And kind of related to that, it seems inconsistent sort of with the strategy that we have so far, where we are doing it fleet by fleet. So buses, airport shuttles, drayage, and presumably public fleets under AB 739, SB 498. I mean, there are some things that need to move now. So I guess I'm not sure what the question is there, but I want to make sure that we're not slowing things down and maybe get assurances there, and also to hear what the strategy is on the light duty side.
Yeah, on the light duty side, the Air Board has a lot more experience and rules on the fleets for heavy duty applications. So this is an early venture on the light duty side. So I would say it's fair to say that we're going to be a little bit further behind on where we're developing rules for light duty. The SB 1014 gives us clear direction on ride hailing fleets. So we're moving per the statute requirements for a 2-year window to meet that specific area of fleets. Light duty, the quantity of cars that are in fleets for the light duty side is something that we need to get a better handle on before we develop rules separate from ride hailing. So that's what we're trying to distinguish. Is 1014 is clear on ride hailing fleets, but we need to get a better inventory and a better understanding of how many light duty vehicles are in other kind of fleets, whether it be private, public, rental for retail, or private use, before we consider rules. So I don't have a position yet on whether we're going to create a all-encompassing fleet rule for everything that's non-ride hailing. I would doubt it, but we certainly want to try and create a structure for a fleet rule that could be used in a similar way on varying types of fleets. That would be a principle, but it's way too early for us to make some assessment to that front. We need to start by first getting a sense of how many light-duty cars are out there in fleets, and which of them are higher mileage with higher populations, because then that gives us a sense of the inventory impact for emissions. For us to be able to develop rules, in this case on light duty, to be able to justify a regulation, we need to get a sense of how big of effect it is on the inventory. For light duty, it's predominantly personally owned cars, and so that's why we have our vehicle automaker regulations, which are our major focus up to this point.
Okay, sorry about that. Julia Levin with the Bioenergy Association of California, and I have a comment rather than a question, and I'm going to sound like the skunk at the party, but it's because I actually really do think what you're doing is urgent, but I also think it's important that it be grounded in the science. And I almost always agree with Bill McGavern, but I have to strenuously disagree with his comment. Transportation sector is not the largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions in California, not even close. It's wildfire. And if you listen to your sister agencies, CAL FIRE and Sierra Nevada Conservancy, wildfire emissions now are greater than all of the reductions we have achieved across every other sector. And they're continuing to grow dramatically every year. Why is this relevant? Because according to CAL FIRE, again, the vast majority of the catastrophic fires we're experiencing in California have been caused by electricity infrastructure. And so when I say that I think we need to come back to the science in this program, the push to electrify everything, and I support it in many, many areas, but we have to ground it in life cycle emissions. And it's troubling that the Air Board continues to ignore the upstream emissions from electricity generation, including now the wildfire emissions that are caused by the electricity sector. And so I just think as we move forward, instead of picking specific technologies, we really need to go back to life cycle emissions, both carbon and air pollution, which, I mean, we all experience the smoke from these fires. in the last few years. It is not trivial. And all of these large fires have been caused by electricity infrastructure. So how is it possible in a science-based agency that we're ignoring the largest sources now of air pollution and climate change emissions in California and treating electric vehicles as zero emission when the electricity is the single biggest source of emissions in California? I'm not saying that we shouldn't push for more electric vehicles, but I guess I do have a question, which is, when are we actually going to account for the upstream emissions and just not just look at the tailpipe? Because I think when you do that, the balance may change, and maybe we should be doing more to promote fuel cell vehicles and heavy duty and other vehicles that can run on carbon negative biogas, which on a life cycle basis would be a lot lower emitting from a pollution and a climate change standpoint than electric vehicles, given how many wildfires are caused by the electricity sector. So it's a long plea to actually put the science back in these programs, because you're ignoring the single biggest source of emissions in California now.
So let me try to address some of those pieces, and I would welcome Tony's input too on the heavy duty applications. First, I'll start by saying, I experienced that smoke too. I have the same passion on the need for the state of California to figure out how we're going to address forest fires, and certainly climate change is amplifying the forest fires. So I have the same passion as you do. But from a program standpoint, I'll make two comments. One is that how we manage forests and the natural working lands is completely separate from our program. So the Air Board will be identifying mechanisms for how we handle that for the broader scoping plan, the broader sector, cross-sector working efforts. But you won't hear about forest management issues from the vehicle regulatory area. But I'm not trying to disqualify those issues. From the official inventory standpoint, to what Bill cited, what is officially in the inventory for requirements to meet AB 32 and SB 32, it is about 50% is the tailpipe emissions for all mobile sources. And then when you add in the upstream emissions from refinery and oil and gas industrial activities, when you add all those up, you're more than 50% of the inventory. But it is absolutely true, to your point, that forest fires and emissions from sinks are not included in that inventory. And I'm not making a judgment as to whether that's right or wrong. That's what was in the statute for AB 32. And the state, as we noted in the 2017 scoping plan, does need to try and figure out how we're going to manage that. That's not our program, but that is I can assure you, a very clear area of discussion between ARB and other programs and other agencies. So I'm not trying to disclose that. Relative to the well-to-wheel, there are a number of the vehicle programs that do account for and analyze with the science the upstream emissions of the traditional sources of emissions. So electricity generation or hydrogen generation, distribution loads, fuel extraction for materials. Those are included in the light-duty regs. We actually had that as a compliance requirement for automakers, and they will tell you they don't like that. But from an analysis standpoint, for most of our regulations, we do include upstream emissions for environmental impact assessments. So I would disagree on whether that's included. But the attribution of forest fire emissions to electricity, that's a much bigger conversation that the Air Board is not involved in terms of attributing that officially to electricity. That's a PUC state legislature conversation that's happening now. So I don't want to comment on that.
I just want to respond. That was an extremely thoughtful and helpful answer, so thank you. And I would just say there are other parts of the Air Board. I believe that new staff has been hired actually to start to better, create a better inventory of fire that's caused by human infrastructure. So it's not natural, it's not wildfires anymore, it's human-caused fires. And I wanted to flag that because I think the time is coming in the next few years when this agency, the Air Board, is going to include it in the inventory when it's caused by human beings. And then we're going to have this massive disconnect between these programs that have been focused on so-called zero-emission vehicles running on electricity that is absolutely not zero emission. I mean, CAL FIRE has already determined the cause of all of last year's fires and most of this year's, and almost all of them have been electricity infrastructure. So it's just a heads up that we can't continue to ignore that. And I think we may be going down some paths without being careful enough about all of the unintended consequences, which, again, I don't mean to sound anti-ZEV or anti-electricity, but we need to keep all the parts of the science to guide us if we want to get this all right. So I do really appreciate your answer, though. Thank you.
David Rentschler, City of Fairfield. I would just ask that you please consider when you're looking at the reporting requirements as to who is reporting. For example, as a public fleet, we contract out to a contractor who operates light-duty vehicles, such as shuttle vans, for our transit side to shuttle drivers out to the buses when they need a break or a lunch break or whatever. While the number of vehicles is small, who's going to report? The city or the transit agency, or is it going to be the contractor who actually operates the vehicles? Please think about that when you're looking at who's going to report. Thank you.
I guess the short answer is, well, thank you for the comment. And yeah, there's a number of factors, including business relationships in contracting out services or trucks or loads versus owning the trucks too. And that's something we do need to balance. And again, reason we need the time to kind of sort out those kinds of questions.
Nico Baukum with the California Fuel Cell Partnership. I think the comment before we started our question session was, let's ask questions that affect both groups. I think light duty and heavy duty, because this afternoon there won't be light duty folks in the room, although maybe in the background. A question related to the regulatory development. We're talking about manufacturers or fleet users, but in that context, because light duty has gone through this process way before the heavy duty group has on the zero emission side of things, and whether that's cradle to grave or well to wheel, or you can decide on that, and I think you will. What are you learning from each other with regards to crediting first movers, the ones that need to take or could take first initiative, because there are activities going on right now. Are those folks getting credits of some sort? I know on the light duty side of things, I think on the heavy duty side you don't really want to, from what I understand of conversations, is that you don't really want to get into ZEF credit trading, but is there such a consideration there? What are your thoughts on that at this point? Or are we going to hear about that when there's a draft piece of regulation and everyone is going to either be really happy or cry foul, which I expect is more the last one than the first one? Thank you.
I'll answer from the heavy duty perspective. In terms of the manufacturer requirement that we have been discussing, we do have a credit trading mechanism that companies could use to determine whether they're building the vehicles or trying to buy credits from others. So that is has been part of the discussion. And then I just touch more broadly is, I think in terms of rules or philosophically, in the heavy duty space, you've kind of seen it. We've always tried to encourage early actors to act before any requirements begin. Clearly, that's what our funding programs are trying to achieve. And we've generally considered factors like that in developing regulatory strategies, that there would be an advantage or a benefit to those who took earlier risks than others who wait until the requirements actually kick in. So I think philosophically, we've done that in the past, and we would look to do that now to encourage those who are either more proactive or in a better position to act early when there is less information out there, that we would want to encourage that and recognize it in a future strategy, so that people don't sit around and wait, because I think that's part of developing the market and gaining experience and acceptance.
What's the light duty side of the table think of that?
Well, the only rulemaking we're moving forward on with fleets at the moment is the ride-hailing fleet rule. So we'll talk more about that when we start getting to the workshops early next year. But I think it is a very real and legitimate, fair question for design of that regulation as to whether we provide credits before the 2023 start date for those companies, or and/or provide crediting trading mechanisms for compliance. So we certainly will look to what we do on the automaker regulations to get a sense of how those flexibilities provide benefit for the regulated party.
Any chance on trading those credits between the two different fleets?
Maybe between light duty and heavy duty?
Yes.
I suppose anything's up for discussion. That's always been pretty difficult to do. The minute you have trading, you want to do that where you provide flexibility for the regulated party, as long as we're moving towards enabling the emission reductions that we need from the rules. If we were to provide trading across sectors, you end up diluting one or the other. So if you had a light duty program that allows credit trading with heavy duty, if the light duty program is moving slower than the heavy duty, and heavy duty does over compliance, that helps with the heavy duty side, but the light duty programs end up not getting the actual reductions that we may need. So of course the overall inventory is the goal, but you still need to have programs that innovate and push for technology rollout within certain sectors. So that's typically not been something that works well.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I'm asking that as well, and you kind of brought it up a little bit already, is this whole infrastructure side of things, because it's essential for any of this on both sides of the fleet side, light duty or heavy duty, to work. So if one side doesn't move very quick, then the other side may be able to move quicker and also has the volume, thinking heavy duty versus light duty with regards to fuel throughput. There is something to be learned and cost reduced through volume throughput that may benefit the light duty side of things, and you may be able to make progress quicker than you are doing now because you're trying to keep things separate really hard.
Yeah, so it's a fair question. I guess it comes down to who is regulated in a potential future rule. If, for example, large, and I'm just using this as a hypothetical, if large companies were regulated for their fleets as a point of regulation, if they have light duty and heavy duty vehicles in their fleets, there's flexibility and possible opportunities there for having some joint crossover between them. So you're minimizing investments, or you're providing most flexibility for investments and yard or corporate facility infrastructure. So I get that, but we're nowhere near making those kind of decisions.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt real quick. There is a question that came over the internet. This is from Celia DeBose with the National Biodiesel Board. She said, unfortunately, I can't attend the in-person meeting that follows this one, so I'm hoping you can provide a brief update on the status of any proposal to mandate that certain percentage of heavy-duty vehicles be zero emissions. Will today's second meeting also be recorded and made available to the public? The answer to that is no. The meeting that we're going to have after this is a more informal work group meeting that will be in person only. We will be capturing notes for that meeting, and we'll publish those notes on our website. But to participate in the meeting, you do need to be present for that one. Go ahead.
Ready? Okay, so I guess I'll just read and go as we go here. So this is from Rob Cram from Holt. Multiple questions, so I'm just going to go through each one. In the near term, are you looking at having fleet reporting requirements, or would it be more of a voluntary reporting deal? The discussion is to have a mandatory fleet reporting requirement. Anybody who wants to provide us information, we have a survey online that you can fill out voluntarily. So yeah, we'll always take more information, but we are talking a regulatory requirement. With regards to reporting, applicable fleets in both on-road and off-road are already reporting via different system, truckers and doors. Any way to minimize redundant reporting would be necessary and appreciated. Understood. And again, to the extent that we already have a lot of information from companies that we might be asking to report, it would be potentially just adding information to existing vehicles. And yes, we would look at finding the most straightforward way to do that and the least burdensome. As far as workshop process between manufacturer and end users, I would recommend having an ORIAG-like committee. Don't remember what the acronym stands for, but I know that that was a committee set up by us specifically on off-road implementation. And we did a similar thing when we did truck and bus rule. We had 5 work groups and subcommittees to work out different issues. Same thing here. Regarding implementation, outreach, and other things of that nature, and even details on how to develop the reporting system. We recommend having that process to facilitate the workshop process. So that's kind of why we do make a distinction between what we label as workshops and work group meetings. In general, the way when we use that workshops, we are going to be discussing regulatory items, tend to be a little bit higher level discussions, and often is informed by work group meetings, where work group meetings are intended to be a little bit more in the weeds, a little more details, working out issues so that we can ultimately have a policy recommendation or develop that influences our policy recommendation. We often and usually will discuss what happened at work group meetings or subgroup meetings as part of a workshop process. So if you do attend our workshops, you will be up to date on what we learned in the meantime without necessarily having to deal with the nitty-gritty details on how we got the data or which data sources we considered before we determined which were the best source. And then number 4 is more of a comment with regards to electric technology in general. I think the Moyer program, that's the Carl Moyer Incentive Program, would be a good tool to help fleets adopt this technology as it comes to fruition. And with that, the Carl Moyer program, there's a HVIP program, which is a voucher for purchasing vehicles that exists today, has millions of dollars available for, I don't even know how many, probably 30 different truck configurations or buses that are eligible for that program, as well as additional sources of funding. So there is a lot of funding opportunity right now, and we expect it to continue for some period of time, including, as was touched on, utilities have been approved, PG&E and Edison, for over $500 million to be used for infrastructure for installing charging on the properties. And HVIP program also does cover infrastructure for both fuel cell and battery electric for vehicles that qualify, or the infrastructure in terms of an incentive program. And that's a continuing discussion on funding policy, separate effort on shaping those funding plans. I'll leave it at that. Okay. Okay, we'll go this side and then Tim. Sorry, Tim.
Jimmy O'Day, Union of Concerned Scientists. Want to echo the notion of keeping progress on rules going forward and supporting the idea that smaller rules in a fashion that keeps the whole process moving forward can be a good thing. But also, recognize that from a manufacturer standpoint, on the truck side, at least having some indications that fleet stuff is also coming. I recognize that concern and think that's important as well. Just want to respond to the idea of attributing emissions to fire emissions to life cycle electric vehicles. As someone that does life cycle emissions analysis, that's a really big leap. You don't hear people talking about holding the tobacco industry accountable for emissions when someone throws a cigarette out the window and starts a forest fire, or the lawnmower industry. The electric infrastructure we have in place that is causing fires is often old. It's not necessarily related to electric vehicles at all. So I think there's really, it's a huge leap in logic to start making that attribution. It's important and critical to include these emissions in the overall state inventory, but assigning them to electric vehicles is a big leap that I would say the life cycle emissions community would not agree with.
I can add to that just a tiny bit. Is one of the things that ARB, PUC, Energy Commission are working on too is further develop inventories with electrification or expanded electrification in mind to also get a better grasp on when electricity is used, because you can provide electricity for a lot of cars and trucks without changing the infrastructure at all, especially if you charge at night. So to fully ascribe those risks to electric vehicles when the infrastructure doesn't change is one extreme, and then how you do it needs to be balanced. That's beyond my pay grade or my area of expertise, but I think that's something on our list to understand. But yeah, I guess I don't want to make sure that people don't automatically assume that it's a one-for-one way to put things together either.
Yeah, Tim Blubaugh with the Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association again. I just wanted to point out there's a lot of discussion about the timing of rules and the manufacturer requirements and fleet requirements. And the EMA members are investing a tremendous amount of money developing zero-emission products, transformative products that they're trying to develop so that they can meet their customers' needs, which is always our goal as manufacturers. And I would just encourage ARB to think very hard as it prioritizes its rulemakings, and we understand the internal demands for rulemakings and timing, that it think about how it can enhance the successful deployment of zero-emission vehicles. I think that always has to be front and center. We're spending a lot of money to ensure that these can be successfully deployed, that we can meet our customers' needs, and we hope ARB does as well.
Yeah, we're about 20 minutes over time. We still have to reset the room for the next meeting. Maybe just one more question. Do we have one more question?
Hi. Oh, it's on. Hi, Hannah Goldsmith with the California Electric Transportation Coalition. So first, just want to thank you quickly for the many opportunities to date to provide input on both the medium and heavy duty manufacturer mandate concept, as well as the light duty and heavy duty fleet thinking. We're supportive of moving forward with the SB 1014 implementation, which you mentioned today on the light duty side, and we did support that bill. We're also very supportive of the existing transit and airport shuttle bus proceedings moving through the process. We are a bit cautious about kind of a broad manufacturer and fleet mandate concepts on the heavy duty side, given how important it is for us to get this right in California and ensure fleets have a positive experience with these vehicles, that they're used in appropriate use cases. We agree that the issue is at least a three-legged stool of vehicle availability, fleet pool, and infrastructure availability. Consumer education and awareness is also critical in both light-duty and heavy-duty sectors to ensure consumers understand the benefits and operational characteristics of ZEVs. We also agree that funding is imperative for the state to meet its ZEV goals, and we thank you for all the hard work that you've done to fund light, medium, and heavy-duty clean vehicles. We'll continue to advocate for adequate and reliable funding, as we have done in the past, to reach the state's goals. And again, thank you for all your work on this.
And thank you. So I'm going to have to conclude the meeting today. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Again, visit our new website, sign up for our listserv. We will be sending out any notices for future meetings on that website.